This is the Requiem Metal Podcast, Episode 4, Dismember. Welcome to the Requiem Podcast, number 4. I'm Mark Rudolph.
And I'm Jason Hundy.
And tonight we're going to talk about another one of the great consistencies of extreme metal, Dismember.
Kind of almost an honor in the same way that Bolt Thrower was of sort of the consistency in approach, and kind of like a Motorhead AC/DC of death metal in many ways.
For sure.
And this is sort of one of the first, I guess, Bolt Thrower is a big band, in some rights, but really Dismember, is one of sort of the big two of the whole Stockholm scene in a way.
And they've really stuck to their guns since, 88, 89 or whenever they're,
sure,
through Carnage and then, into their various incarnations of Dismember.
Absolutely. So this is kind of, for us kind of neat, because this is a band that really, has equally touched us, I guess, whereas like, say, some of the bands we've talked about previous, we each had sort of different levels that we had interest in and stuff. But
this is kind of the first Swedish metal band I ever saw live. Was it? And it was right before Indecent and Obscene came out. We went and saw them in Detroit, me and Chris, and that was quite an experience to see these guys live after idolizing the whole, because there's really not a whole lot of interview coverage. Mm-hmm. You didn't see any videos, so it was just kind of this, mystique to see these guys live. So it was them, and I think it was Deicide Invader, but I could be wrong. But
yeah, and what's interesting about Dismember for me is that, I had heard Entombed Wolverine Blues, but I don't think you can justifiably kind of call that a traditional sort of Swedish Stockholm metal album. Mm-hmm. I mean, by that point, Entombed had really morphed into something completely different. And I think it was my sophomore or junior year, I remember walking into a kind of a record store and finding, Massive Killing Capacity. And that was really my first real sort of traditional Swedish death metal record. Okay. I had already heard like Tiamat Wild Honey, but again, you can't call that traditional Swedish death metal. Yeah. So that sort of, put the imprint in my head of what Swedish death metal was, kind of supposed to sound like.
Yeah, it was the Skogsberg Sunlight Studio sound was like epitomized in like an Everflowing stream. As soon as you hear Override the Overture, it's like, wow.
Sure, absolutely. But
I mean, to the extent that, Bolt Thrower is like the first really extreme band as far as vocally and stuff like that. Dismember was the first really death metal band I listened to that had that incredibly raw, searing guitar stuff that was just like unbelievably, rough around the edges, and just it was like nothing I've ever heard before.
And the sort of thick bass, sort of heavy sound that was so
really hard to even
like
describe if you're just trying to describe the sound to somebody that's never heard this stuff before. It's just an unreal. It's like a hybrid of really high gain on the guitars, but still really thick. A lot of the crust breakdown kind of stuff. And
oh, sure. I mean, and that's the weird thing about the Stockholm sound or the Stockholm scene, which really was kind of built around just a handful of bands like Nihilist, Carnage, Carbonized, Therion, and House of Usher. All of those bands sort of, developed this really sort of unique sound, like the guitar sound you're talking about, coupled with the sort of the bass sound, and then almost this, just a totally different way of singing death metal vocals, kind of like almost a sinister, like upper register. It wasn't like the deep growl, like grunting stuff. Kind of stuff. It was more of a scream. I mean, would you akin that to sort of their influences, like Repulsion and Autopsy more? Compared to, say, what the Florida stuff was doing? Or?
Yeah, Autopsy kind of ran the gamut as far as vocals went. They had, like super guttural stuff, more screamy, screechy stuff. They kind of went all over. And I really attribute most of Matty Karki's stylings, the vocalist for Dismember, most of his stylings are completely informed by Chris Reifert from Autopsy.
From Autopsy, yeah.
And they talk about Autopsy, ad nauseum in interviews, and they've done several covers. And
sure, absolutely.
They really owe a lot to Autopsy.
And we had mentioned before, and I know you said that Chris Dick, one of the other people who may join us in some of these podcasts, had seen Repulsion in Flint, Michigan when he was quite young, and really didn't know how to sort of formulate what the hell he was seeing there and putting it into any kind of context. Mm-hmm. But I think before you talk about Stockholm, you really do have to just at least give a brief mention of Autopsy and Repulsion for a second. Sure. Now, you're infinitely more familiar with with Autopsy than I am because I came into Autopsy only really 4 or 5 years ago, and Repulsion.
I came into Autopsy maybe like 10.
So
that was really late. It was another one of those things where we'd been listening to so many, European bands that it was like, oh, it's from America, but we didn't like Cannibal Corpse, and then we associated that kind of sound with Autopsy's logos and covers, and it was just a stupid
sure, it was all gore, and from a surface level, you really don't know how to put Autopsy in any place.
But yeah, Autopsy musically are way more diverse than you would think. I mean, I could even say, mention that they'd probably have a lot to do with the whole doom scene, grindcore. I mean, all this stuff is they're kind of like a hybrid of that whole scene.
Sure, it was like death metal, but with like some sludgy sort of riffing at a lot of times.
Brought a lot of like catchy stuff into it. It's really kind of beyond definition, but.
And Autopsy were from California, correct?
I believe so.
Yeah, because I know some of those guys had some involvement
with the Bay Area.
With Death.
Yeah.
I think was Reeford on Scream Bloody Gore?
He was either on Scream Bloody Gore or...
I'm pretty sure it was Scream Bloody Gore because Rick Ross from Massacre was on Leprosy, if I'm not mistaken. So, and I know Chuck had actually wanted those guys from Autopsy to sort of fly down and permanently sort of settle in Florida, but
wants to live in Florida?
No one those guys just said, screw it, good luck with the band, and went back and basically formed Autopsy, and then, kind of in a separate, bubble, Repulsion, another band that, I think eventually we're going to do a show kind of focused on Repulsion and Autopsy, but, they sort of formed out of, Flint, Michigan, almost to obscurity, and then kind of faded away until Relapse sort of brought back their sound. But it seemed to be like
touring now.
Really. Yeah, it was just sort of strange. But in a way, it seemed like they almost had no direct influence on any American bands. But for some reason, they
tape trading thing.
Yeah, they translate it and kind of gave birth almost to the Swedish death metal sound. Yeah, in a sense.
Because back in the day, nobody really talked about. I'm speaking in early '90s. At least people we were around weren't really talking about Autopsy that much, but the guys that are really entrenched in the whole grind scene worship the guys. I'm just like, what's so special about Autopsy?
Sure.
And even those first couple records on Peaceful are kind of tough to find at some point. They've all been since reissued and in really nice packaging. But when I first started hearing more about Autopsy is when they're doing Abscess, and that just totally turned me off with urine junkies and all this stuff. No, this is not up my alley whatsoever. So,
and I think it should speak pretty loudly that Autopsy's records were coming out on Peaceful. I mean, they weren't even on an American label.
1988 in Peaceful,
so again, hard to find even in the States, even if you were an American death metal fan. So, but anyway, so the sound, kind of eventually took roots in the Stockholm, Sweden area, and kind of, out of this grew Nihilist and Carnage, Carbonized, Therion, House of Usher, and the two that we really should mention are Nihilist and Carnage because they obviously kind of really formed the nucleus of the whole Stockholm scene. Because Nihilist, once they sort of broke down, was essentially the core of Entombed, and then Johnny, who went on to form Unleashed.
Johnny Hellid went to form Unleashed, and then with Carnage, we've got the basis of pre-Carcass Mike Amat,
sure,
and then also Johnny Dordevic that he quote unquote did vocals on Clandestine, the second Entombed record.
He did clandestine vocals, really, mystery vocals.
I think he's basically just posing in the video more than anything. He's not really. I think it's kind of been dispelled that he actually sang and it was Nicky doing vocals. But that's another show.
Yeah, exactly. That's another one. But essentially, Carnage was Dismember. It was totally. We'll get to the core members of Dismember in a second, but it was it was Fred Etzby, Marty Karki, and David Bloomquist were the three guys from Carnage that went on to form Dismember, and then Mike Amat, who joined Carcass for Necroticism and Heartwork, and then now obviously gave birth to Arch Enemy. So, I mean, there's a lot of really, deep bloodlines coming out of these two groups of Nihilist and Carnage.
Well, and even some of the Carnage songs were repurposed for Dismember, like, Torn Apart.
One of my favorites, which wasn't refurbished, but Infestation of Evil is really kind of a pretty neat tune as well.
I think actually there's a couple songs that renamed title-wise too that were reused at some point. I think there's an interview that we did with them at one point that actually broke all that down for us. But
yeah, and Carnage put out a record called Dark Recollections, which I had the tape of it, and then
Earache put it out again with a bunch of bonus tracks. Well, they put it out in 2000. I'm sure it's probably still in. You can probably get on Amazon or something.
Sure.
But,
and that's worth getting if you really want to see where the
it's got their demos. The Dayman Lost demos are put on there. So
cool. And then out of that, Dismember came out, and they came out with, what were the names of some of those early kind of demo recordings? Was it Dismembered and Last Blasphemies and Reborn in
Blasphemy, Dismembered. Dismembered.
Yeah, some Swedish version of English, I guess.
Oh, yeah, and a little bit of trivia. The Dismember, we're going to be called Dismemberizer, but the logo, the piece of paper that Nicky Anderson was drawing the logo on was too small. So he had to cut that part off, which Dismemberizer would be a pretty cool name. But
yeah, and so kind of cool that Nicky Anderson, who went on to basically be the founder of Entomb, more or less, of the Nucleus of Their Sound.
Oh, and speaking of him, he did all the
logos.
He did all the guitar leads on the first record too. So
okay, did he?
On like an Everflowing Stream, he's credited with doing all the guitar leads. Yeah, I think at this time, I mean, these guys were just looking by pictures, they look like they're 16, 17 years old.
Yeah,
Nicky was kind of like a wunderkind of that era, I think.
And Nicky went on, I mean, he's done, Helicopters, and now he's back kind of doing this more traditional, almost like Autopsy Repulsion type stuff with Death's Breath.
Yeah.
And isn't he doing something else that's a little bit more, or is that somebody else?
I really don't know.
I can't remember. I can't keep track of some of these guys, but
yeah, it says all leads by Nicky Anderson, except on Override the Overture by David Bloomquist. Yeah. I think that's how that's how we've said his name for so long.
Bloomquist, yeah.
Bloomquist, because it's Qvist, but we'll leave that up to you scholars out there.
Yeah, we're giving it the American Anglo pronunciation. So, and then the demos kind of came out, and then right around the same time that they had gotten out of the sort of demo game and had actually gotten into the studio, Entomb was also in the studio doing their debut,
Left Hand Path.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Left Hand Path came out prior to
it kind of killed a lot of the thunder off Everflowing Stream. I think if this would have came out before Dismember or before that Entombed record, I think it'd be totally different. Like history would be different.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, in a way, it's
a more visceral record, completely, and it's more. I mean, it's more over the top. I guess Entombed might be a little bit more accessible as far as like it's not the themes aren't quite as in your face and as this is. But as far as just this was like an incredible introduction to Swedish death metal.
Sure.
Like after I heard the first record, I never looked back.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I mean. It's kind of unfortunate because I think that Entomb record, the release date is 1990, and this is 1991.
Yeah.
But essentially,
basically, I think
recorded at the same time.
Entombed or Earache beat them to the punch, and they were Dismember was shopping this around for a while until Nuclear Blast showed any kind of interest. So
yeah, which is really sort of unfortunate. But that kind of stuff sort of happens.
Sure.
You talk about who sort of. I don't know if you want to go back in history, the Beach Boys and the Beatles were always sort of fighting back and forth as to who was innovating first, Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper's, kind of going back and forth, who stole ideas from who. And
look at who make more money at the end. And
exactly.
Who's got more critical acclaim. It's just, you just split it.
and these guys were all friends, and that's the coolest part about these Swedish scenes, they almost sound, everybody's in everybody else's band. It's very incestuous in many ways, and you'll see the same thing. And when we, start talking about some of the Gothenburg bands as well, they're all, hey, this guy was vocals on this band's first record, and then he switched to another band,
back in the day when we were still doing, I'm not sure if it was when we were doing Requiem magazine or Eclipse magazine, but I was actually going to draw out a family tree interlinking all the Swedish death metal bands, and it was a pretty daunting task, just all the information I'd gotten, and this was pre-internet, so I was digging through CDs and this name's spelled a little bit different. I don't know if this is the same guy, and people using like Necrolord and all these different pseudonyms, so it's hard to kind of get it across.
It's hard to keep
but it was a very tightly knit.
Oh, absolutely. And we should mention, just as a sort of, I guess, a plug, not for really anyone we know, but there's this a book on Swedish death metal that's about to be released stateside, and I've gotten to see the European version, as you have.
It's fantastic.
Do you remember what it's called? I can't remember.
It's just called Swedish death metal.
Is that all it is?
And it's like a 500-page tome of a bunch of interviews, just kind of like how the scene began, and then at the back it's got a great index of like every possible Swedish death metal band signed or demoed or anything. So it's pretty nice. I can't think of the guy's name offhand.
He's in the band.
He's in Incision. He's been they did a write up on him in Decibel a couple months back. Yeah, and actually, I think Richard Christie, he's got a label or not a label, but it's a book publishing house that's putting it out in the States.
Oh, really? Oh, Richard Christie from Death. That's pretty cool.
I think that's who it is. I could be completely wrong, but I think that's true.
Well, anyways, let's maybe get to some music a little bit here. their debut, like an Everflowing Stream. What are your thoughts on it? This is more your era in the early '90s when you were kind of encountering some of this stuff.
This was this was a record. As soon as it came out, I listened to this thing back to back to back. I couldn't tell you how many times. This was really this was one of the first band out of. I mean, Entombed had a lot of stuff going on in the first record, but I think Dismember did more of like the some more of the heavy metal, not heavy metal cliches necessarily, but they really mixed it up as far as slowing down a lot and like doing a lot of like more atmospheric type things and really doing some really catchy stuff. But then the next song just like beat you over the head with his brutality. So
would you go so far as to say that Dismember like may have had more kind of distinctive Judas Priest, Iron Maiden influences, where Entombed was taking a little bit more from like the New York Dolls, Stooges sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that was sort of being translated into
especially now
ways.
that at the time I hadn't heard half that stuff. So, but having heard Stooges and all that kind of like garage rock stuff, you can totally see where they go back to with Entombed and see like Nicky Anderson's his whole propension for all that stuff. And these guys are definitely way more. I think they were way more into like listening to stuff in the scene. And as soon as Entombed starts, I think with Wolverine Blues, you can kind of tell they're not really listening to death metal anymore. I mean, these guys always seem like they've kind of had their ear close to the scene to see what's going on.
Yeah, and
they've always been really metal, like death metal fans. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think not that I want to get talking about Entombed, but I remember press photos for Wolverine Blues where some guy he's wearing a CBS Sports hat, a Dinosaur Jr. T-shirt, and a Sonic Youth hat or something like that. And I think
they're trying to distance themselves from this scene, which I don't know. It's.
In some ways I can understand because I'm sure they were right in the center of like,
they're right on the cusp of being like, we're going to be on Columbia Records. Maybe we should do a little,
should we sell out a little bit?
Show what some of our other influences are or whatever. But
and I can see where that comes from. And Nicky kind of grew disinterested in the whole scene eventually and kind of formed Helicopters. But anyways, getting back to like an Everflowing Stream, when I encountered this, I think I heard it on cassette tape first, just to date ourselves here. And immediately, obviously, the opening number, sort of stands out, much the same way that the opening number on Left Hand Path, Left Hand Path.
It even reminds me of even like some old Slayer stuff. How it starts out with like the thunderbolt, the rain, and then enter Dismember.
Yeah, it's very epic kind of beginning. So, and I think off this record, you really get the formation of their sound and really on like an Everflowing Stream and then kind of pieces afterwards. We were talking about a distinct difference in how they kind of almost soloed. There wasn't as much sort of Iron Maiden influence yet. They were still doing very traditional like, death metal.
Yeah, like hammer-ons, a lot of like Slayer, just like, tons of random notes and dive bombs leads and stuff like that, where it's just more like noise than, Bloomquist totally had, you could tell he loved Iron Maiden to no degree. Yeah. And with the later on records with Indecent and Obscene, it first starts to surface a little bit and you can hear that. But,
sure.
And it's when I first heard it, it was kind of jarring. It's even more so in Massive Killing Capacity. But when I first heard that guitar tone, I was like, wow, this doesn't really seem like it should work. But eventually it kind of wore me down. I like it now. But
yeah, I think at the time it was so like almost threatening in a way to like what they had originally tried to do. It just
seemed out of place. Yeah. It just seemed like, we got, Andy LaRocque to come in and do these guitar solos or something. It seemed weird, but they've made it work over the years.
And the two songs we're going to hear off Like an Everflowing Stream are going to be Override the Overture and In Death's Sleep. Any particular thoughts that you have on those, or other than that they kick a lot of butt?
They kick some major butt, man.
Yeah. So...
I think these two songs kind of show the different extremes of the record, like how varied it really is, and we'll let the music do the talking for us here. So here's Override the Overture and In Death's Sleep.
from dream to dream, we have always been like an ever-flowing stream.
Welcome back. You just heard Override the Overture and In Death's Sleep from Dismember's Like an Everflowing Stream, which was their debut on Nuclear Blast Records in 1991. And the next thing we're going to turn to, is they took a very, I don't want to say a distinct turn, but they definitely said, well, we're not going to try and repeat ourselves right away.
Yeah.
And they put out an EP afterwards called Pieces. And before we go any further, and this is, my bad that we didn't do this. We should probably tell you who the heck's in the band. I know we've mentioned a few of the guys, but Maddie Karki and David Bloomquist and Robert Sennebeck, that was the vocalist and the two guitar players. And then on those first few albums, was Richard Damon always the bass player? Or
it's Richard Damon. His real name is Richard Cabeza.
Oh, okay.
But he'd change it back and forth.
Yeah, because Cabeza eventually left, I think, right after death metal, correct?
Yeah, that was his last record.
And then really one of the kind of the nucleus of the band and the band leader in many ways, which was really interesting in the Stockholm scene.
The drummers
the drummers were the sort of the band leaders, because Nicky Anderson was Entombed. But the drummer for Dismember was Fred Espy, who also did not only a lot of the songwriting, but he did a lot of the actual production in the studios, along with Thomas Skogsberg out of Sunlight Studios, which is kind of a notorious studio in terms of developing and cultivating this sort of deep, sort of Swedish Stockholm sound. And then later he would help out bands like At the Gates and Catatonia. Did some stuff with Skogsberg. I mean, he's done so much.
Well,
it's almost ridiculous.
He's to Swedenwood. What's his name from
Scott Burns from
and,
Morris Sound Studios in Florida.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, just sort of the uber producer. But anyways, I had remembered that we hadn't really mentioned who was actually in the band. We were just kind of blazed forward.
And I want to also mention that definitely do yourself a favor and look online to see this album art, because this is, in my opinion, probably the best death metal cover ever. It's, all 5 members of the band with their hair tied together in a pentagram, and they're decapitated.
Yeah, and we're talking about the follow-up to Like an Everflowing Stream, which was the Pieces EP.
Yeah.
Just a real, Dismember were already starting to attract a little bit of controversy.
Yeah.
Because of a song off of Like an Everflowing Stream, which was called Skinner Alive.
Yeah.
And Skinner Alive, we didn't really want to get too heavy into the, all
it's
this
been reported
stuff.
better than we could really say.
Yeah,
so
but essentially they got sued and,
Yeah, they were in the British court for a while, and their answer to the whole court case was case number Obscene off of Indecent and Obscene. So,
yeah.
I mean, that kind of, I think that whole court proceedings, like, kind of, at least,
it was like free promotion, too.
Yeah, and it shaped kind of like where they went lyrically for the next record. So.
Exactly. And so I think they I don't know if it's kind of the next 2 albums that they did, Pieces, which was an EP, and then Indecent and Obscene, I think they decided to really sort of shove it in the face of the courts and the powers that be.
Oh, yeah.
That we can get away with anything we want. Like this is not music to be taken too terribly seriously. It's like horror movies. It's like anything
it's imagery else to match the intensity of the music kind
Absolutely.
Of thing. So,
and and a lot of bands have sort of run into this. Back with the PMRC, in the '80s with Twisted Sister and Judas Priest and Ozzy Osbourne
and Marilyn Manson and everything else.
And Slayer just recently got in trouble for this sort of stuff. But
it's
sort of odd because they don't typically pick on the death metal bands. I think probably because they can't understand most of the time.
And it doesn't have the distribution that like Slayer or somebody has. I mean, these guys are on Nuclear Blast America at this point, which was Relapse was promoting all this stuff. But I mean, I'd say Pieces maybe sold 1,000 copies, 1,500 copies in the States.
Yeah, initially. I'm sure it's gone on.
I'm sure,
more,
and I don't know how it was in Europe if it sold more or not, but they did seem like an odd band to pick on. With who are they really reaching?
Yeah, exactly. Some fringe guys that probably already know plenty that this is fantasy music and not meant to be too taken seriously. So,
but this one, on a production note, they almost tried to I think one up themselves what they did on Like an Everflowing Stream, as far as it seems like they pushed the gain as far as they could possibly go. Everything is just completely in your face on this record.
It's like a Spinal Tap 211 kind of record, in terms of the amp, the wattage or how it's sort of working, to kind of create a strange sound. And it seems like this was a fun EP for them to make. They do a cover of their own song, Torn Apart, on this. It's got sort of, just a ridiculous intro and just some other things on the back. They're in, bizarre, almost sort of theater makeup.
Promo photo. I got, it's all 4 of them, or all 5 of them standing there, Maddie Karki in the center, holding what's supposed to be a human heart in his bloody hands. And I remember I got a promo package from Nuclear Blast. My mom saw the photo and she just kind of walked around and laughed.
Yeah, this was definitely one of those, Dismember, if you encountered their song titles and their lyrics and things like that, it was something that would definitely chase you out of the room, I think. So.
And this came out, I was a junior in high school. This is 1992 that Pieces came out. So this was, this affected me.
Yeah, I bet.
This kept us going, but...
Yeah, but we're going to hear Wish You Hell from Pieces next.
Watching sky aura, passing the fall, crossing the bridge, torches about the souls of love, and it failed by my sins. No forgiveness, journey begins. Rachel hell of a man, sickening form of caress. Kiss the ghost someday, I'm here to bleed.
You're listening to Dismember, and we just heard a pretty exciting track called Wish You Hell off of Pieces. And we mentioned how on the back of that cover he's holding a heart, which very well could come from the torso on the cover of the next record, Indecent, Obscene, which features some, I don't know if you could call them great special effects sort of gore art, but it's kind of funny.
It's serviceable,
sort of stuff. And it's someone with an open torso of some sort with a Dismember logo stamped in it and some guts and blood.
Funny thing, this was actually a belt buckle that you could buy through Nuclear Blast.
So if you didn't want to put the belt buckle on your belt and you simply wanted to attach it literally to your organs, they're showing you how. And it says off to the side on the spine, it says "music to mangle your mind," and I think that's fairly appropriate. So, and Indecent Obscene is pretty much the most popular of all the Dismember records in terms of album sales, from what I've heard.
Really?
Yeah, that's what I was just doing some reading, and it said that it's the most successful album they had ever done because it featured a couple tunes that got some video play.
Yeah,
like "Dreaming in Red," which
actually, I think that was the one that had Fred Aspie dressed as Jesus on the cross.
Did it?
Yeah,
okay.
I'm pretty sure because that's. I think they actually have a clip of it in here for his band photo.
That's pretty cool. Oh yeah. And again, I wish we could sort of visualize some of the things here.
This stuff's all available online. I'm sure you can probably go on YouTube and find the video.
For sure. But Indecent Obscene is really sort of where they kind of shift their sound out of the kind of early era, the primitive era, and they start to add some more kind of progressive elements of like Iron Maiden riffs, and they just sort of more dynamic
They work
sounds.
on breakdowns. They have some, like the first two, I think these are the two we're going to play too.
Yeah, Fleshless and Skinfather.
The breakdowns on those two are fantastic. And this album, I hadn't listened to it for a couple years. Like every time I throw it back on, I'm impressed at how well it holds up and how dynamic all the songs are. I think they're really on their A game for this.
And I think for a while, I'll speak personally about this. I think the cover. I didn't really know what to think of the cover when I was younger, and I think it probably chased me away a little bit. Because I was just like, I maybe threw it in with the rest of the kind of the gore stuff and just assumed it would be kind of lackluster in some ways. Where it's the total opposite. It's a very dynamic record musically, and it really shows them sort of moving in this new direction.
I believe isn't Pieces and Indecent Obscene on one record now?
Yeah, I think you can get it together as a really nice collection, which is an odd. It makes sense from a chronology sort of way, but musically, it's almost like, if you listen to Pieces first, like
it'd be kind of jarring, really.
Sure. Well, actually, I think on my version, I do have the two of them together, and Indecent Obscene, ends with this great song that we're going to end this next set with, Dreamy in Red, which has a lot of melodies and things like that. And then, that album sort of fades out, and if you're just sort of not paying attention, all of a sudden Pieces jumps in. It just really, like you said, jars the hell out of you a little bit. But, so, Fleshless and Skinfather and Dreamy in Red are the three we're going to hear here. And what is it, in your opinion? I mean, Dreamy in Red sort of it's a very different element to it.
Well, they kind of brought, I think this might be the first instance where they kind of bring in this epic, actually Dreamy in Red's all instrumental as well, isn't it?
No, but it has a long instrumental sort of beginning.
Intro.
Yeah,
because they seem it's almost like what Immortal went on to do this. On every record, they have like their slow epic song that they like Mountains of Might or something. But Dismember seemed to do that same kind of thing with this really catchy pseudo Iron Maidenish, but just incredibly dynamic, slow epic song that they seem to either. A lot of the time, on some of the later on records, either end the record with it, or it's like second to last or something. But
and Entomb kind of almost did the same thing with like Through the Colonnades and some of the other kind of tunes that were had like long intros and stuff, and then kind of would build into.
But Entomb kept they were pretty short as far as time. Yeah, on most of the songs, it was more of a rock format or punk format.
Sure.
But these guys, they started dipping into the Iron Maiden well and the Judas Priest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stuff a little bit here, but that they use that kind of technique to go on. Let's I'm trying to think of the other. Of course, I usually listen to these things back to back, and I don't pay attention to song titles. So this is going to be my downfall.
Massive Killing Capacity, I know, which is the one that ends right after this, kind of features a couple of tunes like Nina, which is sort of almost a long Metallica like Orion type epic instrumental and stuff. And then there's other instrumentals like on the God That Never Was features that. The one
where Angels Fear to Tread, is that it?
No. The Phantoms of the Oath, which is really almost like Phantoms of the Opera from Iron Maiden, and that was an instrumental. So really strange and kind of interesting that Dismember was one of the first Stockholm bands for sure that ever did a lot of death metal instrumentals. You really
and even now there's not really a whole lot. I mean, minus the whole Pelican kind of 5 thing, but
I think that's
straight. That's coming to a totally different thing. But for Stockholm death metal, that was totally kind of an anomaly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and you can sort of see that sort of shift kind of occur here on Indecent Obscene. So I think the trio of tracks that we're going to play are Fleshless and Skinfather, which really serve a dynamic kind of 1-2 punch to open the record up, and then the album closer, which is Dreamy in Red. But this is one of those albums that's just great from start to finish. It's very, very consistent, and really the first 3 or 4 Dismembers are almost kind of flawless in a way.
Oh, sure.
There's really not much that's wrong with them. So enjoy Fleshless, Skinfather, and Dreamy in Red. just heard a trio of Dismember songs there. You heard Fleshless, Skinfather, and Dreamy in Red from Indecent, Obscene, the second full-length record from Dismember, and really the third release after the Pieces EP. Mm-hmm. So, and next up, I'll let you kind of talk a little bit about this for a moment.
Well, this one was the third, basically third full-length, Massive Killing Capacity. Was kind of, I enjoyed it and everything when it first came out, but this is where they really started using that weird lead sound.
It was very catchy. I mean,
the songwriting is super catchy. But it seemed like there was half the band that was really kind of had their foot firmly planted in that whole Swedish, Stockholm sound, and then other guys that were trying to like, I really like, progressive stuff, like Maiden and Priest and Manowar and stuff like this. But this is the record where they really kind of decided, okay, we're just going to try to take this someplace different.
And I think this speaks loudly of where the scene was at, and I think in 1995. I think if you look at the nucleus of where, especially the Stockholm scene kind of grew out of the late 80s and early 90s, Entombed had put out Clandestine in 92, the year after Like an Everflowing Stream. The Pieces EP was put out in 92. Entombed kind of not really doing much in 93. That's when Indecent Obscene sort of came out. And then I think there was almost a lull, especially in the Stockholm scene around the time in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
And I think, Entombed decided to go kind of in a different direction. I think maybe Dismember saw that, well, maybe we need to try something like a little bit different so that we're not kind of repeating ourselves so much. And I think maybe they're trying to inject, I don't want to say new life, because certainly their first few records are awesome.
I think they're just trying to see, as you're maturing in a band, you want to try to see what you can do to push yourself. But this is kind of like maybe their attempt at trying to
diversify their sound.
Or maybe being a little bit more accessible to new audience or something.
Sure.
But,
and I'm sure
isn't this the time that like Meshuggah, the first Meshuggah was coming out, and like there's a whole other wave kind of.
Sure, and Gothenburg was starting, and Gothenburg was based a lot on melody, and I think people were kind of magneting towards Slaughter of the Soul from At the Gates and the First in Flames and First Dark Tranquilities. I think maybe that pull on Dismember definitely pulled them in a different way. I think the album holds up incredibly well because I was talking about from my perspective, this is the first Dismember I ever heard, and I remember, going into a record store, I think my sophomore year in high school, and ordering Tiamat Wild Honey, and Chris at the time, who did the magazine with Mark, was working. He said, "Oh, you're ordering Tiamat," and he gave me a Relapse Nuclear Blast sort of promo called the UHF VHF. And it featured, a lot of, previous mentioned, Meshuggah and Dissection, Amorphous, and some of these bands. But
Pyogenesis on that as well?
I think so. Yeah, Pyogenesis was on there. But amongst those songs, the one that really stuck out was On Frozen Fields from Dismember. And I think by that point, I had already heard Entombed. I think there was part of me that had this, it was like peanut butter in the brain kind of thing. I love that sound of that guitar. And we're going to play on Frozen Fields in a moment. But again, it just blazed. It was super catchy, but super heavy. And it had such a different feel to it than anything that was coming out of America at the time.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't bludgeoning you in the head. It
wasn't Mortician or...
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't even...
This is the kind of the time of the New York death metal as well. I think the Suffocations, Incantations, the TION bands.
Yeah, exactly. Immolation, and all that kind of stuff. And Obituary had kind of almost run its course by this point. They were on World Demise, and we won't go into that. But
it was. In general, it was kind of it was the first lull of death metal, I think, and then that's when I'm sure we'll talk about on other shows when the whole Gothenburg scene kind of stepped up to the plate. The generation 2 of Swedish death metal. So
and what's interesting about this is I think Dismember essentially created this sound, and then they kind of ran away from it, I think, because it did all right. I think it was a fairly popular record, but I think they were seeing this huge shift, and I think they felt compelled to sort of say to themselves, do we want to keep moving this direction right away, or do we want to go back to our traditional fans? And I think they kind of got caught in this era that we'll talk about in the next talk set, where they really were trying to regain their sound.
Funk.
Yes. Yeah, they really were sort of trying to figure it all out again. And
even going through, before the show, picking out what tracks we wanted to play, we're like, wow, we could really just cut a lot of these out because, the whatever idea we think is coming across in these songs is better serviced by a different era of Dismember.
Sure. And it's funny because, you know, it's almost like they've now gone back to the formula of massive killing capacity and Indecent, Obscene.
Yeah, I think
they left it for like 8 years and then decided, you know what,
the new record is almost a return back to Indecent and Obscene era.
Yeah.
But with, you know, a much more matured sensibility. But
so it's kind of like, you know, it's weird when bands like experiment and no one kind of like people sort of reject that experimentation.
Paradise Lost, you know, right after what was it, Draconian Times? You know, they do 1 Second, which is a fantastic record, but it's completely different than what they're doing. You know, the whole kind of like proto Metallica ish, you know, really epic songwriting, and then they did 5 records or something, and then they came back with this last record, which was In Requiem, wasn't it? Which is, I mean, they were kind of leading up to that with the last couple, but yeah, they totally kind of came back to the same thing. Like,
and they said, "Screw it! This is what we should have been doing. We shouldn't have listened to like the critics and all this. We should have been."
I think they wanted to, they wanted to pull away from, because everybody sees it as a dead end venue, but it's not, because the fans never leave.
Exactly. And so Dismember learned that lesson the same way that I think a lot of bands do. You know, so. Anyways, let's get to this trio of songs. We're gonna start with "I Saw Them Die," which is almost, you know, it's utterly catchy, and we'll let them, you know, the listeners sort of decide. And on "Frozen Fields," which has more of a override the Overture kind of feel to it in a certain sense, you know, which you already heard. So you're gonna hear "I Saw Them Die" and "On Frozen Fields" from Massive Killing Capacity.
All this sudden enjoyment of
So that was also, I saw them dying on frozen fields from Dismember's massive killing capacity. And the next thing that Dismember sort of jumped into is, they kind of went on hiatus for a couple years, almost like 2.5 years. And that was a really sort of interesting time if you were to look at metal, because that was really sort of the rise of Gothenburg sort of sound, and also the rise of black metal. Finland was sort of starting to get involved. Amorphous was becoming huge. Opeth had sort of now entered the field by this point. And so Dismember's coming back out of this, 95 was like the edge of the precipice, like the end of that first real era. And they sort of come back, and it's almost like, what's going on? And they're trying to find their identity almost again.
Well, yeah, and they're waving their flag with what we're about, with the name of their next record, which is death metal.
Yeah, and I remember. I mean, I'll speak pretty honestly. I bought the Misanthropic EP, and which is a song that we're gonna play off of death metal, and that was cool, and it had an Autopsy cover on it and some other things. And I don't even think I bought death metal for years.
I didn't buy death metal until last year.
Yeah.
And it was just one of those things like,
other stuff was going on in metal at the time. And it seemed like, they're just going to be doing the same thing they've always done. And I've got 4 Dismember records. Why do I need another one right now? And I sort of felt that way about the next couple records, Death Metal and then Hate Campaign. And, Death Metal is a good record. We should go on we should say that, when you go back solid. And listen to it now.
Yeah, if you're a completist, there's really not a Dismember record you shouldn't get. We're just trying to, for the confinements of time here, is just kind of like, if you're interested in anything that's going on here, these are maybe the ones you want to check out first. But I've since gone back and got everything.
Absolutely, and then they tried to return back to their kind of form with this and sort of steer away from the massive killing capacity stuff.
Yeah.
And then, this was put out 97, 98 is when death metal came out. And then they had one more record to do for Nuclear Blast, which was Hate Campaign, which, if you hadn't known any better, you wouldn't even known the record came out. It really was one of the quietest.
There was no press. This came out in 2000, and I don't remember seeing any interviews, any press, nothing for it. It's got kind of a lame cover, really. It looks like a Terminator head coming out of some fire. And the whole record seems like they just kind of like wrote it in the studio as they're going along. There's really not a standout track. It's solid. I enjoyed it. I got it as a promo, and I was just like, well, I'm not going to sell it. It's Dismember. It's decent, but really nothing new. They didn't bring anything new to the table on this record at all. So
and this is where too you're starting to see some lineup changes for really the first time, when Richard Cabeza left and they brought in Charlie D'Angelo, who plays bass.
Which I totally didn't even realize that until you mentioned
Witchery
it pre-show.
And some other bands,
But even his like distinct bass sound that even like brings to with like stuff with Merciful Fate and Arch Enemy, he has no presence on this record. You can't even tell he's there.
It's like a session bassist or something like that.
Yeah, it's like, why didn't just one of the other guys kind of step up and do it? But
absolutely. And I really do think this is, sadly, kind of a stagnant period for the band. I think
completely.
I think they took some time off after this, because they really sort of go on hiatus for a while. I think wasn't Fred, the drummer, wasn't he recording quite a few other bands' material at the time?
Yeah, I think he was doing a lot of producing and recording for Sunlight.
And I think,
or maybe even his own entity at that point.
And I can't remember what the name of his studio was, but I think what was wise is that they decided to take some time off, and they left Nuclear Blast. I think gave themselves an opportunity to get a shot in the arm to reinvigorate and almost kind of reinvent themselves.
Well, at this time too, Murder Squad was coming out, which was Matty Karki and a handful of other people. That's basically just an autopsy worship kind of band. So it seems like there might have been some tensions in the bands as far as like where we want to go with this stuff, and this was just kind of like, well,
we have an obligation.
We can agree on this.
Yeah, exactly. We have an obligation to record one more CD for Nuclear Blast, so we do this, and we're happy with it, but it's not going to blow people's socks off.
Sure.
And then they went away for a while, and then they came back
They came back on Candlelight in 2003 with Where Ironcrosses Grow, which I think it stands up there in one of their better records. I think it's they kind of came back to they discovered that sound again that the undefinable Dismember sound they brought back on this record.
Sure, a lot more Autopsy influence, but
Sure.
also on the flip side, there's still owing a lot more to Iron Maiden too. I mean, it's almost these two.
There's that weird
worlds being
marriage
brought
that's
together.
come back together, and they're accepting one another now. So
Absolutely. And it's a great record, great cover. I mean, again, everything sort of speaks loudly that this is a band who's now found almost their second era.
Oh, and even another echo of a return to form is a Dan Seagrave cover. One of these lost Seagrave covers, which is great. Which actually on Where Ironcrosses Grow and The God That Never Was are both Seagrave. Like these covers that he did as like a piece for somebody that they didn't want, or he just did them as his own personal stuff, and it's really great to see those come back.
And Seagrave had done Like an Everflowing Stream, correct?
Yeah,
and, Left Hand Path,
and
some Edge of Sanity covers. He had done, I think, Unorthodox, or was it Spectral Sorrows?
He did Spectral Sorrows. He did a ton of the Florida death metal bands.
Yeah, he did Morbid Angel, Altars of Madness.
Yeah, he's a pretty prolific guy.
A really, and I think that's, again, and we can probably speak to the history of death metal in a lot of ways, and we don't want to get too heavily into it right now because we're kind of focused on Dismember, but there was almost a renaissance of death metal around 2001, 2002, when almost a new generation was kind of now discovered.
The whole hardcore crowd that was getting into bands like I'm going to sound like a fogey because I can't remember anybody.
Well, Unearth and Dillinger Escape Plan and Cave In and Converge.
They're like they're rediscovering those At the Gates roots and Shadows Fall. Yeah. So it's all that stuff's being reinvigorated, and I think it kind of percolated back down to Dismember. Like, well, wow, we're let's show them what it's all about, not this watered down
exactly.
stuff. So,
suddenly you had 15-year-olds buying like At the Gates records, and so Dismember is like, hey, this is a perfect opportunity to reinvent ourselves, and like you said, slam these kids and show them what this real stuff's about.
Yeah.
So, but where Ironcrosses Grow was just a fantastic record, and then I think They were so reinvigorated. Maybe they poured all their good ideas into this record, because the next one,
this was 3 years later. It's okay. It's just I never listened to the whole thing.
Yeah,
I get about halfway through and I'm just like,
Yeah, and that was The God That Never Was, and not to bemoan the band too much, but it wasn't. To me, it represents a very distinctive end of a band in many ways, and I think in some ways,
if they would have ended on Where Ironcrosses Grow, it would have been a good career. This was just kind of like they outstayed their welcome a little bit too long.
Sure,
but,
and this is really where Fred Espy was going to decide after this record to leave the band, and in many ways, that's like when Nicky Anderson left Entomb. You got to ask yourself, this is the nucleus of the whole band.
Yeah, do
you end it at this point? And I think they probably had to make some decisions, and luckily they didn't. And but what they did do is sort of, and I don't want to get into it too much yet, because we're going to sort of end our last Talkset talking about this new record that's about to be coming out. By the time this podcast is sort of projected, it'll definitely be out, and that's the self-titled Dismember record. But we are going to play a couple songs that sort of represent some of the songs from this era that we were talking about. We're going to play Misanthropic from the death metal record from 1998, and then from Where Ironcrosses Grow, which is the fantastic record we were just talking about, we're going to play Where Angels Fear to Tread. Welcome back. You just heard Where Angels Fear to Tread from the record Where Ironcrosses Grow, and then the first song you heard was Misanthropic from Death Metal by the band Dismember.
So now we're back to, we talked a little bit about the God That Never Was. It was kind of they weren't floundering on the record too much, but it was just kind of stock.
Yeah, and to me it was a real end point for, I mean, we mentioned how Massive Killing Capacity was sort of the first watermark of kind of a dip or an end of an era. This is really the end of the second phase and almost the complete rebirth of the band.
Yeah, really.
It almost was sort of like recycling back to the first three records again. You know, they had this sort of uncomfortable middle period where they had some hits, some misses.
And I think Edsby, kind of, I mean, he was always, it seemed like he was into what he's doing, but he didn't want to tour anymore. He's got a wife and a couple kids, and he's just like, well, I think I'm just kind of done with this. And I think you can kind of tell that his enthusiasm was lacking in the last couple of records. But usually, I'm not a big fan of when the constant rotating lineup. But in this case, on the next Dismember record, the self-titled that's going to be out, by the time you hear this, it's probably already been out for a couple weeks. Comes out this April. Mm-hmm. Just called self-titled. Just Dismember. They've actually got 3 new members, and we've got
Martin Persson, who joined on The God That Never Was, and then Tobias Christensen, which I don't know which record he would have joined on. I'm sure he's the bass player, maybe The God That Never Was as well, or possibly
showing my ignorance of this record. But
and then the drummer who came on after Fred left was named Thomas Don, and he was from Incision and Repugnant. And Incision, of course, is the band we mentioned before that the gentleman who wrote the Swedish Death Metal book was in. So all kinds of strange connections going on here. But I think you're right. I think with some injected new blood and sort of saying, well, let's erase the slate. Fred's not around. We can sort of start from a totally different perspective. Let's look at the strengths that we've always had. Let's go back to those strengths. Mm-hmm. The Autopsy sound, the Iron Maiden sort of sound, even some of those early Stockholm kind of dive bomb sort of Slayer leads, let's throw it.
When they're getting back to the single picking, riffing kind of stuff that basically the whole Swedish death metal sound kind of came from.
And what's interesting is the person who produced this for the first time. And I don't know if Fred decided not even to produce this record as well, even after he left the band, was the new bassist for Entomb, a guy by the name of Nico Elgstrand. And I don't know much about this guy. I don't know if you do either.
No, I know nothing. So we're pleading ignorance on this. He could, be a fairly prolific producer.
Yeah, could be. But I, in a way, my hunch tells me is that here's a guy who is probably younger.
Sure.
Joined Entomb. He's probably was like us, a fan of that original era of sound. And he probably did the same thing that Rick Rubin did with Slayer when they first signed on.
I think he heard something that the band didn't know they could do,
and he said,
do again.
Why don't you test yourselves? Why don't you go back and do what you're good at doing and stop piddling around with whatever the hell you're doing and little instrumentals and things like that really are going nowhere. And they're showing your chops, but they're not written. They're not showing your songwriting skills, and let's get back to writing some punchy, in your face.
For the most part, I think death metal records don't usually stand alone as single cuts. It's usually, from my experience, the whole record is the experience. And with the new self-titled Dismember, they're totally reinvigorated. Mm-hmm. And in a recent Decibel interview that I read, they mentioned that it's all recorded analog,
which would be again that throwback to that warmth that they had on those original songs, that the analog.
I'm thinking that that's really going to bring. We've heard some early promo tracks that have just been MP3 files, but I'm excited to actually get the real CD and throw it on a nice set of speakers and be able to really soak it all in. So
absolutely. So this is sort of where we're end things. We'll come back and maybe make a final comment or whatever. But we're going to play a trio of songs off this new record, and we're going to play Under a Blood Red Sky, which has this really nice kind of dynamic of Iron Maidenism sort of in the end of it.
It's got complete Iron Maiden twin leads, and it's really nice.
Really awesome stuff. And then,
but it seemed like they actually figured out in the song, where can we put this where it makes sense. It's not, it's not playing over the top of these razor sharp, rhythm guitars. They actually break down the song and hey, this is where it might actually work to build the song.
Oh, sure. So, absolutely. And then The Hills Have Eyes and Combat Fatigue. And The Hills Have Eyes is I mean, it almost sounds like it could be demoed off of Indecent, Obscene.
It sounds like it came out in 1989. Yeah. It's unbelievable. And the first little riff on Combat Fatigue is fantastic.
Yeah, there's some
it's
cool
almost
noodling kind of stuff that's...
Yeah, I don't know where to place it, but it had like almost a feel of some of those crazy old Destruction riffs.
I was going to say the German thrash sort of scenes, the Creator, Destruction, Sodom kind of stuff is really sort of classic on this. So we hope you enjoy these brand new Dismember songs, and I think this is a cool way to end the show too, because here's, we didn't pick the band because they have a new record out, but we have a unique opportunity in that you're about to see like the rebirth of a new era of Dismember, and this is kind of a nice way to kind of go out with a band like this. So enjoy a trio of songs from the self-titled record from Dismember. You just heard Combat Fatigue, The Hills Have Eyes, and Under a Blood Red Sky from the forthcoming or brand new Dismember record, which is self-titled. And
probably be about a month old by the time you hear this.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
For all intents and purposes, it's new. So,
and kind of a neat way to go out with a brand new sound from these guys. And so hopefully you've kind of gotten a nice overview of Dismember and can kind of see where, really one of the classic, I think there's probably like 5 or 6 sort of essential Swedish bands that you have to.
That's probably a show in itself, is just, for the 5 essential Swedish records kind of thing of a certain era. But yeah, definitely Dismember is one of the big guns in the, the early days of the Swedish death metal scene. Even if, you've been listening to them for the last like 5 or 6 years and really like them, go back and, see some of these earlier records and, really knock your socks off.
I think it holds up pretty well. So we'd like to hear your thoughts as well on what you think about Dismember, what you think about us, what you think about the whole format of what we're doing, good, the bad, the ugly. And you can email us at requiempodcast@gmail.com.
That's REQUIEM podcast@gmail.com.
So for the Requiem Podcast, I'm Jason Hundy.
And I'm Mark Rudolph.